November 19th, 1967, Hill 875, Central Highlands, South Vietnam. Specialist Fourth Class James Kelley pressed his back against a shattered tree trunk as mortar rounds impacted 20 meters upslope. The jungle canopy that had provided cover 3 hours earlier now hung in tatters, stripped by artillery and automatic weapons fire. His platoon from Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, 173rd Airborne Brigade, had been climbing this ridge since dawn. They were supposed to be reinforcing Alpha Company. Instead, they had walked into a prepared ambush executed by the North Vietnamese Army with precision that suggested months of planning. Kelley counted heads in his immediate vicinity, 14 men visible. His company had started the day with 122. Then he noticed something that contradicted everything battalion intelligence had briefed. The enemy firing positions weren't random. They were fortified bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, constructed from logs and packed earth, positioned at measured intervals across the hillside. This wasn't a skirmish line. This was fortress warfare transplanted to a Vietnamese mountain. What had been described as a reconnaissance in force against estimated company-strength enemy forces had become a fight for survival against a fully entrenched North Vietnamese regiment that had spent October fortifying Hill 875 into a killing ground. The 173rd Airborne Brigade, numbering approximately 1,400 combat infantry across multiple battalions, faced elements of the North Vietnamese 1st Division, totaling an estimated 12,000 troops dug into the ridgelines surrounding Dak To. The numerical disadvantage approached 10-1 in some engagements. By the time Hill 875 was secured on November 23rd, after 4 days of continuous fighting, the battle would claim 158 American killed and 402 wounded, while inflicting over 1,600 confirmed North Vietnamese casualties. It became one of the bloodiest small unit engagements of the Vietnam War, proving that firepower, air support, and absolute refusal to retreat could overcome overwhelming numerical disadvantage, but the price would be measured in casualties that shocked even commanders hardened by 2 years of jungle warfare. The order came through battalion headquarters at 0700 hours on November 19th, transmitted via radio from Colonel James H. Johnson, commanding officer of the 173rd Airborne Brigade. The 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, would conduct a combat assault up Hill 875 to relieve Alpha Company, which had been pinned down for 2 days near the ridge's northern approach. Charlie Company would lead the advance, followed by Delta Company, with battalion headquarters and medical personnel positioned in the center of the column. Intelligence reports estimated enemy strength at perhaps 1 company, maybe 2. Light resistance expected, standard sweep and secure. Lieutenant Colonel William J. Livesey, commanding the 2nd Battalion, had
objections. His paratroopers had been operating in the Dak To area since early November, encountering fortified positions on every ridge they assaulted. The North Vietnamese weren't patrolling, they were preparing. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations indicated the presence of the 174th Regiment, elements of the 66th Regiment, and possibly units from the 32nd Regiment, all belonging to the North Vietnamese 1st Division. That meant thousands of troops, not hundreds. But the order stood. Alpha Company needed relief, and the 173rd had a reputation for never leaving anyone behind. Charlie Company began climbing at 08:30 hours. The hillside rose at a 45-degree angle through triple canopy jungle so dense that visibility extended perhaps 20 meters in any direction. Point squads advanced slowly, machetes clearing paths through bamboo thickets. The heat was oppressive. Humidity approached 100%. Men carrying 70 pounds of equipment, ammunition and water moved in single file along trails that barely qualified as paths. For 2 hours, they encountered nothing. No enemy fire, no defensive positions. The ridge seemed abandoned. Then, at 10:42 hours, the jungle exploded. Machine gun fire erupted from positions the paratroopers couldn't see, hidden behind logs and packed earth 15 meters upslope. Mortar rounds began impacting along the American column with precision that indicated pre-registered firing coordinates. RPG rockets streaked through the canopy. The ambush wasn't random. It was orchestrated. Every bunker position had interlocking fields of fire designed to catch advancing troops in converging kill zones. The paratroopers dove for cover behind trees and rocks, returning fire at muzzle flashes they could barely identify through the vegetation. What battalion intelligence had called light resistance was revealing itself as months of preparation. North Vietnamese engineers had spent October fortifying Hill 875 with the same methodical precision that built Dien Bien Phu. The bunkers were constructed from multiple layers of logs reinforced with earth, resistant to everything except direct artillery hits. Firing ports provided protected positions for machine guns positioned to cover every approach. Communication trenches connected defensive positions, allowing NVA troops to shift forces without exposure. This wasn't a hasty defense. This was fortress warfare, executed by an enemy who had known the Americans were coming and had prepared accordingly. By noon, Charlie Company had suffered 40% casualties and hadn't advanced 50 meters. Worse, North Vietnamese troops had moved behind the American column, cutting off retreat routes and surrounding the battalion on 3 sides. What had been a relief operation had become a fight for survival, and the paratroopers trapped on Hill 875 were beginning to understand that intelligence failures measured in bad estimates cost lives measured in good men who wouldn't see. Nightfall. At 1300 hours, First Lieutenant Lawrence Oquendo ordered his platoon to assault the nearest bunker. The paratroopers rose from cover and moved upslope through vegetation so dense they couldn't see their own men 5 meters away. Machine gun fire cut them down before they reached the firing port. Oquendo himself took rounds through both legs and collapsed. The survivors dragged him back to the company's makeshift perimeter, where medics worked frantically with supplies already running low. The assault had gained nothing. 3 men dead, 7 wounded, the bunker still intact and firing. The jungle terrain made flanking maneuvers impossible. The hillside offered no open ground for maneuver, no clear lines of sight for coordinated attacks. Every approach channeled paratroopers into prepared kill zones where North Vietnamese gunners waited with overlapping fields of fire. The NVA had studied this mountain for months, identifying every avenue of approach and fortifying accordingly. The Americans were fighting blind, shooting at sounds and muzzle flashes, never certain where the next burst would come from or how many bunkers remained hidden in the vegetation ahead. Lieutenant Colonel Livesey called artillery danger close to his own position. Fire Direction Center at Firebase 16 acknowledged and began plotting coordinates. At 14:15 hours, 105mm howitzer rounds began impacting 30 meters upslope from the American perimeter. The explosions shook the ground, trees shattered. The artillery walked forward in 50-meter increments, systematically hammering the enemy positions. Paratroopers pressed themselves flat against the earth as shrapnel whistled overhead. For 20 minutes the barrage continued. When it lifted, silence held for perhaps 10 seconds. Then the machine guns opened fire again. The bunkers had survived. Air Force forward air controllers circling overhead vectored F-100 Super Sabres onto the ridgeline. The jets screamed through at 500 knots, dropping high-explosive bombs and napalm canisters that turned sections of jungle into walls of flame. The napalm worked temporarily. North Vietnamese troops withdrew into underground bunkers and tunnel systems, waiting for the fires to subside. When the aircraft departed to refuel, the NVA emerged and resumed firing positions. The Americans had gained perhaps 50 meters of scorched earth at the cost of 6 more wounded from shrapnel. The horror wasn't the visible enemy, but the invisible one. Paratroopers fought an opponent they rarely saw, firing at positions they couldn't identify, watching friends die from bullets that came from nowhere. The psychological weight was crushing. Wounded men screamed for medics who crawled through fire to reach them. Company aid stations overflowed with casualties. Morphine supplies ran low. Plasma ran out. Medics used their own bodies to shield wounded soldiers from incoming fire, knowing that medevac helicopters couldn't land through the canopy, and enemy fire made extraction impossible. By 1700 hours, Charlie Company had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Of 122 men who had started the day, 48 were dead or dying, 39 were wounded too severely to fight, and the remaining 35 held a perimeter 50 meters in diameter. Delta Company, advancing to support Charlie, had walked into the same kill zone and suffered similar casualties. Battalion headquarters personnel, clerks and communicators trained for rear area duties found themselves fighting as infantrymen because there was no one else left. As darkness fell, North Vietnamese mortars began targeting the American positions with accuracy that eliminated any possibility of random fire. Forward observers were calling coordinates, adjusting fire with each salvo. Rounds impacted inside the perimeter, killing men who had survived 12 hours of combat. The paratroopers dug into the volcanic soil with entrenching tools and bare hands, creating shallow fighting positions that offered minimal protection. They knew the night would bring probing attacks, infiltration attempts, and continued mortar fire. They knew casualties would continue mounting, and they understood with absolute certainty that no relief would reach them before morning, if morning ever came. The sound came first, familiar and welcome. The distinctive roar of jet engines penetrating the jungle canopy. At 1858 hours on November 20th, paratroopers looked skyward with desperate hope. Close air support had been requested hours earlier. Artillery had provided temporary relief, but only aircraft carrying bombs and napalm could suppress the North Vietnamese bunkers long enough for the wounded to be consolidated and ammunition redistributed. The forward air controller circling overhead vectored a Marine Corps A-4 Skyhawk toward the target coordinates. The pilot acknowledged and began his attack run at 500 knots. The triple canopy jungle made visual identification nearly impossible from altitude. The pilot relied on smoke grenades that forward observers had thrown to mark enemy positions. But smoke drifted in the wind. Distances were difficult to judge through vegetation that obscured terrain features. The pilot's cockpit instruments showed coordinates that matched the target briefing. He armed 2 500-pound Mk-81 snake-eye bombs, adjusted his dive angle, and released ordnance at precisely 1858 hours. One bomb impacted outside the American perimeter, killing 25 North Vietnamese troops and demolishing 2 bunkers. The second bomb hit Charlie Company's command post and aid station directly. The explosion was absolute. 42 paratroopers died instantly, many of them wounded men who had been awaiting evacuation. Another 45 were wounded by the blast, adding to casualties that already exceeded the battalion's capacity to treat. The bomb had landed inside the American perimeter, turning a desperate situation into catastrophe. Specialist Fourth Class James Kelley, who had survived the ambush and 12 hours of continuous combat, was thrown 15 feet by the concussion. When he regained consciousness, he found himself lying beside men he had eaten breakfast with that morning. Some were dead. Some were dying. Some screamed for help that no longer existed because the medics who had been treating them had died in the explosion. The aid station had ceased to exist. Medical supplies, already depleted, had been destroyed. Plasma bags hung from shattered trees, their contents spilled into volcanic soil. Captain Harold Kaufman, commanding Charlie Company, had died in the blast. First Sergeant Charles Jett had died beside him. The company radio operator had died with the radio still strapped to his back. Major Charles Waters, battalion chaplain, had been moving among the wounded, offering last rites when the bomb hit. His body was found later, still clutching his rosary. The paratroopers who survived worked frantically to treat the newly wounded with whatever supplies remained. They tore uniform shirts into bandages. They used rifle slings as tourniquets. They performed amputations with combat knives because there were no surgical instruments left. The bitter mathematics were unavoidable. More Americans had died from their own bomb in 2 seconds than from any single North Vietnamese action during 24 hours of combat. The weapon, meant to save them, had killed more effectively than the enemy they faced. The psychological impact was devastating. Men who had maintained discipline through ambush, artillery, and night attacks now struggled with the knowledge that their own forces had delivered the killing blow. As darkness fell completely, North Vietnamese commanders recognized the opportunity. Intelligence reports from forward observers had detailed the explosion inside the American perimeter. The enemy knew the 2nd Battalion was wounded, disorganized, and psychologically shattered. Orders went out to multiple NVA companies: prepare for final assault, overrun the American position before dawn, annihilate what remains. The paratroopers on Hill 875, reduced to fewer than 200 effective fighters, prepared for the attack they knew was coming and understood they might not survive. The order reached Lieutenant Colonel James H. Johnson, commanding the 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry, at Firebase 16, early on the morning of November 20th. His battalion would immediately deploy to Hill 875 to relieve the 2nd Battalion. Johnson understood what the order meant. His companies had just finished securing the firebase after brutal fighting against the NVA 66th Regiment on Hill 855. They were exhausted, under strength, and low on ammunition. Now they would climb into the same kill zone that had shredded the 2nd Battalion, but the decision had already been made at brigade level. No American unit would be abandoned while relief remained possible. The tactical calculation was brutal, but necessary. Withdrawing the 2nd Battalion under fire through enemy-controlled terrain would result in catastrophic casualties. The wounded couldn't walk. Helicopters couldn't land through the canopy. The only option was reinforcement, establishing a defensive perimeter strong enough to hold until a coordinated assault could secure the hilltop. This meant committing additional forces to a battle that had already proven costly beyond initial estimates. But the 173rd Airborne Brigade operated on an ethos inherited from World War II. Sky soldiers never leave their own behind. Alpha Company, 4th Battalion, landed by helicopter on the northeastern ridgeline near Firebase 12 at 1100 hours. They began following the ridge toward Hill 875, advancing through jungle where artillery and airstrikes had killed dozens of North Vietnamese soldiers who lay twisted among shattered trees. As they approached the 2nd Battalion's position, the trail became littered with American and NVA dead from the initial ambush. Bravo Company landed at the base of Hill 875 and began climbing the southwestern slope under continuous sniper fire. They reached the 2nd Battalion's perimeter around 1600 hours. Charlie Company arrived at 20-30 hours. Alpha Company, delayed by terrain and enemy resistance, didn't link up until approximately 2000 hours. The relief force brought ammunition, plasma, morphine, and most importantly, additional rifles. The 2nd Battalion's survivors, some of whom hadn't eaten in 24 hours, received sea rations and water. Medics from the 4th Battalion began treating wounded who had received only emergency first aid since the friendly fire incident. The psychological relief was as important as the physical. The trapped paratroopers had spent a day and night believing they might be overrun. Now, they had brothers beside them, and the mathematics of survival had improved slightly, but the strategic situation remained desperate. Both battalions were now committed to Hill 875, increasing American strength to approximately 600 effective combat troops. The North Vietnamese still held the summit with an estimated 400 to 600 soldiers in fortified positions that had already proven resistant to artillery and airstrikes. The NVA hadn't withdrawn. They hadn't been defeated. They waited in bunkers connected by communication trenches, prepared to defend ground they had spent October preparing to hold. The relief operation had succeeded in preventing the 2nd Battalion's annihilation, but it had also created a concentration of American forces in a confined area that the enemy could target with mortars and artillery. As night fell on November 20th, both battalions prepared for what they knew would come: a final push to take the summit, or a final North Vietnamese assault to finish what the ambush had started. Either way, Hill 875 would claim more lives before its story ended. The artillery began at 600 hours on November 22nd. Firebase 16's 105mm howitzers and Firebase 12's heavier 155mm guns fired in coordinated sequence, systematically targeting every grid square on Hill 875's summit. The barrage continued for 18 hours, interrupted only for Air Force strikes that dropped high explosives, napalm, and 20mm cannon fire onto positions that had already been pulverized. The jungle canopy that had protected North Vietnamese bunkers for 3 days was systematically obliterated. By nightfall, Hill 875's crest resembled a lunar landscape, stripped of vegetation and pockmarked with craters. The defoliation was complete. The tactical advantage the NVA had exploited through concealment no longer existed. The final assault order came through at 0530 hours on November 23rd, Thanksgiving Day. The 2nd and 4th Battalions, 503rd Infantry, would attack from the northeastern slope where they had been pinned for 4 days. Simultaneously, the 1st Battalion, 12th Infantry, which had been airlifted from operations in the southern central Highlands in an emergency nighttime redeployment, would assault from the south. The multi-axis attack was designed to split North Vietnamese defensive fire and prevent them from concentrating forces against a single approach. Artillery would provide covering fire until the attacking companies reached the assault line, then shift to targets beyond the crest. At 0700 hours, the paratroopers moved forward. They advanced through terrain they had attempted to cross 4 times in 3 days, past positions where friends had died, through burned jungle that still smouldered from napalm strikes. The resistance was lighter than expected. North Vietnamese soldiers fired from some bunkers, but the coordinated defense that had shattered the initial assault no longer existed. The artillery bombardment had collapsed tunnels, destroyed communication trenches, and forced NVA troops into isolated pockets. At 11:22 hours, elements of Delta Company, 112th Infantry, reached the summit from the south. Minutes later, paratroopers from the 4th Battalion reached the crest from the north. Hill 875 had been secured. The North Vietnamese had withdrawn during the night, using tunnel systems and covered routes down the western slope that American forces hadn't blocked. They left behind approximately 60 charred bodies, abandoned weapons, and fortifications that had cost American lives to overcome. The paratroopers who reached the summit found trenches filled with enemy dead, bunkers collapsed by artillery, and scattered equipment indicating hasty withdrawal. The hilltop they had fought 4 days to secure measured perhaps 150 meters at its widest point. For this ground, 158 Americans had been killed and 402 wounded. The 2nd Battalion, which had numbered 434 men on November 19th, had suffered nearly 70% casualties. The cost demanded examination. Hill 875 held no strategic value beyond denying it to the enemy. No roads crossed it, no villages lay nearby. Within weeks, American forces would abandon the position and the jungle would reclaim what artillery had destroyed. The battle had been fought because the North Vietnamese had occupied the hill, and American doctrine in 1967 dictated that enemy-held terrain must be taken regardless of its strategic importance. This was the mathematics of attrition warfare. Inflict casualties exceeding those sustained, measure victory in body count, hold ground until ordered to move elsewhere. But North Vietnamese casualty reports, recovered later from captured documents and prisoner interrogations, told a different story. The 174th Regiment, 66th Regiment, and elements of the 32nd Regiment had suffered an estimated 1,600 killed during the Dak To campaign. Multiple regiments that had been preparing for the upcoming Tet offensive had been decimated fighting for hills they would ultimately abandon. The tactical victories the Americans questioned had produced strategic consequences neither side fully understood in November 1967. Hill 875 had been secured at terrible cost, but the cost to the enemy, who had prepared that kill zone for months, had been catastrophic. The question that would haunt both sides was whether any hilltop in Vietnam was worth the lives spent taking it, and whether battles won at such cost could ever translate into wars won at acceptable price. The final casualty reports reached MACV headquarters in Saigon on December 1, 1967. The 173rd Airborne Brigade had sustained 208 killed in action and 645 wounded during the Dak To campaign. The 4th Infantry Division's 1st Brigade added 86 killed and additional wounded. Combined American and South Vietnamese forces reported 376 killed and 1,441 wounded across the entire operation. For the 173rd Airborne Brigade alone, which deployed approximately 3,200 paratroopers to Dak To, the casualties represented a 27% loss rate. The rifle companies that had conducted the actual assaults suffered over 50% casualties. Hill 875 specifically accounted for 158 American dead and 402 wounded in 4 days of fighting. The numbers demanded context. Intelligence analysts examining captured documents and prisoner interrogations pieced together what the North Vietnamese had intended. The 24th Regiment, 66th Regiment, 174th Regiment, and elements of the 32nd Regiment, all belonging to the People's Army of Vietnam 1st Division, had established positions throughout the Dak To area in October 1967. Their mission was to destroy a major American unit, demonstrate that U.S. forces could be defeated in conventional battle, and prepare regiments for the upcoming general offensive scheduled for early 1968. The official U.S. body count claimed 1,644 North Vietnamese killed, though this figure remained controversial. More conservative estimates placed NVA losses between 1,000 and 1,600 killed, with additional hundreds wounded and captured. What mattered strategically was that multiple NVA regiments intended for the Tet offensive had been so severely mauled at Dak To that they couldn't participate as planned. The tactical lessons were clear. American firepower, when concentrated and properly coordinated, could overcome significant numerical disadvantages. The 173rd had fought outnumbered often by 10 to 1 in individual engagements. Artillery support, tactical airstrikes, B-52 bombardments, and helicopter gunships had provided the margin of victory. The United States had fired 151,000 artillery rounds, flown 2,096 tactical air sorties, and conducted 257 B-52 strikes during the 3-week campaign. This represented firepower on a scale that no army in history had previously deployed in such concentrated form. The North Vietnamese, despite superior numbers and prepared defensive positions, couldn't withstand sustained bombardment of that magnitude. But the strategic implications were ambiguous at best. Hill 875, like the other ridges fought over during November 1967, held no permanent value. American forces abandoned the position within weeks. The jungle reclaimed terrain that had cost 158 lives to secure. The entire Dak To campaign had been fought to prevent North Vietnamese forces from controlling remote highlands that served no function beyond being terrain the enemy wanted. This was attrition warfare at its purest. Kill more enemy soldiers than you lose, measure success by body count ratios, hold ground until ordered elsewhere, repeat the process indefinitely. The precedent established at Dak To would haunt American strategy for the remainder of the war. US forces could win every tactical engagement. They could inflict casualties at favorable ratios. They could take any hilltop, clear any valley, defeat any enemy force that stood and fought. But tactical victories didn't translate to strategic success when the enemy controlled when and where battles occurred, when ground taken was ground abandoned, when casualties inflicted didn't prevent the enemy from continuing operations elsewhere. The 173rd Airborne Brigade had proven at terrible cost that American paratroopers could defeat numerically superior forces in fortified positions through courage, discipline, and overwhelming firepower. They had also proven, though few recognized it in November 1967, that winning every battle didn't necessarily mean winning the war. The North Vietnamese would learn from Dak To avoid conventional battles where American firepower could be brought to bear. 3 months later, the Tet Offensive would demonstrate that the enemy could sustain losses at Dak To and still launch operations across South Vietnam, proving that body counts and hilltops secured were incomplete measures of progress in a war where the enemy defined victory differently than the United States. The veterans returned to Hill 875 in November 2007, 40 years after the battle. They chartered helicopters from Con Tum and flew low over the Central Highlands, following the same ridgelines their companies had climbed in 1967. The jungle had reclaimed everything. The bomb craters had filled with vegetation. The bunkers had collapsed and disappeared beneath undergrowth. The trails they had followed under fire no longer existed. One veteran, pointing toward dense jungle covering the slope where Charlie Company had been ambushed, said simply that nothing looked familiar. The mountain had forgotten what men remembered. Hill 875 remains largely unknown compared to battles like Ia Drang, Khe Sanh, or Hue during the Tet Offensive. Those engagements received sustained media coverage, became subjects of books and films, entered public consciousness as defining moments of the Vietnam War. Dak To received brief attention in November 1967, then faded from national memory. Perhaps this was because the battle fit no convenient narrative. It wasn't a siege like Khe Sanh. It wasn't part of a larger offensive like Tet. It was simply a hill that Americans fought to take, paid terrible cost to secure, then abandoned weeks later when operations shifted elsewhere. The mathematics of attrition warfare produced casualties, but not stories that civilian audiences could understand or generals could explain. But the paratroopers who fought there understood something civilians and generals didn't. They had been asked to climb a fortified ridge against an enemy who outnumbered them significantly, using tactics that channeled them into prepared kill zones. They had been bombed by their own aircraft, surrounded by enemy forces, left without evacuation for their wounded. They had watched friends die for ground that intelligence had underestimated and strategy would later abandon. Yet they had accomplished their mission. They had secured Hill 875 through courage, discipline, and absolute refusal to surrender, even when surrender appeared rational. They had proven that American soldiers could win any tactical engagement if ordered to do so, regardless of odds or cost. The tragedy was that such courage had been expended on ground that held no lasting value. Hill 875 sat astride a section of the Ho Chi Minh Trail's southern extensions. Controlling it denied the North Vietnamese one route among hundreds. Taking it demonstrated American resolve to contest enemy movements through the Central Highlands. But the hill itself mattered only because both sides agreed it mattered, a circular logic that defined much of the ground war in Vietnam. The paratroopers who died there believed not in the strategic importance of volcanic soil and jungle vegetation, but in each other. They fought because their brothers were fighting. They died because retreating meant abandoning wounded comrades. The mission was each other, not the hilltop. The 173rd Airborne Brigade Memorial stands at Fort Liberty, North Carolina, though many veterans still remember when it was Fort Bragg. Black granite panels list the names of sky soldiers killed in Vietnam. The Dak To section includes 158 names from Hill 875 arranged alphabetically without regard to rank, paratroopers and officers remembered equally. Visitors can touch the engraved letters, feel the texture of sacrifice measured not in strategic objectives achieved, but in lives that ended believing the mission mattered because the men beside them mattered. Hill 875 proved that Americans could win the impossible fight through firepower, courage, and refusal to accept defeat at the tactical level. It also proved, though few recognized this in November 1967, that winning every battle didn't translate to winning the war when the enemy defined victory differently, when ground taken was ground abandoned, when body counts favorable in ratio still meant the enemy could replace losses and continue operations. Some hills are worth remembering even when they weren't worth taking, because the men who died there demonstrated that courage and brotherhood can overcome any tactical disadvantage, even when strategy itself remains flawed. That lesson survived the jungle's reclamation of Hill 875, survived the war's conclusion, survived the decades that followed. The names on black granite testify not to strategic success, but to something more fundamental, that ordinary Americans asked to do the impossible, accomplished it, and that their sacrifice demands memory even when their mission defies justification.